Good morning, Dan and Amy. Stephen Hayward over at Powerline Blog asked the question, are Democrats ready to give up on identitarian politics in the wake of a surprising performance by House Republicans, picking up 9 seats, maybe going to as many as 13, including our friend Burgess Owens in Utah, who's who's the winner. That's great.
Yep, because they had him losing, but now he's the winner.
And
Good for him.
The answer, at least from Raphael Warnock, who is a Democrat Senate candidate in Georgia, he's the opponent of Kelly Loeffler in that runoff. The answer seems to be no from Raphael Warnock and those that still drive the Democrat Socialist Party into that runoff and perhaps into a Biden administration.
America needs to repent for its worship of whiteness on full display this season. How is it that you can insult everybody, call Muslims something other than children of God, call Mexicans murderers and rapists, insult the disabled? How is it you can insult everybody, but then one weekend somebody discovers in the recording that you insult those whose daughters and wives look like those who have been supporting you, and then all of a sudden we can't take it anymore. Repent for the worship of whiteness.
Reverend Warnock does a heck of a Reverend Jeremiah Wright impersonation, doesn't he? The worship of whiteness, part of the lack of sway that I think identitarian politics has, even as it continues to advance, is it just doesn't stack up to what people see in the real world. The worship of whiteness, is that's what's going on? I wonder if people in Appalachia think that their whiteness is being worshipped in this country. And that's the subject, in part, of Kevin Williamson's new book. Kevin Williamson is correspondent for National Review. His new book, Big White Ghetto, Dead Broke, Stone Cold Stupid, and High on Rage in the Dunk Woolly Wilds of the Real America. That's some title. And he joins us now. Kevin, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Good morning.
Morning. So what about Reverend Warnock and the worship of whiteness? Turns out that being white in America it doesn't necessarily provide entrance into exclusive clubs.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. You know, what's interesting to me about that is that the Democratic primary gave people on the left a chance to nominate a much more radical candidate than they did. They could have had a socialist like Bernie Sanders. They could have had someone who was really deep into racial politics instead of someone like Joe Biden, who's pretty clumsy on that. But they ended up rallying behind Biden, and that was really led by African-American voters. My read from that is that there's just not nearly as much of a popular mandate for this kind of social radicalism as a lot of people in the Democratic Party seem to think that there is. On the flip side of that, we've seen what my book is about, which is, we spent the last 4 years spending a great deal of time talking about the white working class, or more often the white non-working class, rural poverty in places like Appalachia, which I spent a lot of time writing about, and the various social problems like addiction that go along with that. And a lot of this ends up being an example of what I call Williamson's first law of politics, which is that everything is really, really simple if you don't know anything about it. And the book is an attempt to give people some actual information about what's going on in parts of the country that a lot of the media doesn't write about and doesn't cover that much and doesn't know very much about.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit, because it strikes me as a bit of a cross between J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy and Chris Arnotti's Dignity in many respects, although your use of language is much different than theirs. But one of the points that you make that I wanted to explore with you is that you write, in effect, welfare has made Appalachia into a big and sparsely populated housing project. Too backward to thrive, but just comfortable enough to keep the underclass in place.
Yeah, well, there's actually a section about housing projects in Chicago in there that kind of goes along with that argument pretty well. But yes, so what we have in a lot of Appalachia, and the place I've really spent a lot of time writing about is called Owsley County, which is in eastern Kentucky, and it's the poorest county in America most of the time when the census comes out. And what you see in places like this is that people who have any kind of skills or ambition or education, typically leave and they go some other place and they find jobs and make lives somewhere else. And often not that far away. Sometimes it's one of the larger cities in Kentucky. Sometimes they go other places. But welfare dependency creates a situation economically where you can have a large population of people who are left behind who don't have the really, really pressing economic incentive to do something else. And so you get what I call the sociological salton sea, which is as it gets smaller and smaller, the poisons get more and more concentrated. And so you get these really, really dysfunctional places like Alsea County where you've got, something like 70% welfare dependency, this whole underground economy based on food stamp fraud, quite a bit of drug addiction and that sort of thing. But on the flip side, very little violent crime, about half of the national average. So it's always a more complicated story once you go in and look at things and start talking to people and figure out what's actually going on.
Yeah, I noted that, and I wanted to get your hand on why you think the violent crime rate is surprisingly low, given, one of the popular myths that persists is poverty equals commission of crimes. And it's not true in black neighborhoods in the cities either. It's a small fraction of people that commit the majority of the violent crimes, but that's the perception.
Yeah, I think that it's not poverty that causes violent crime. I think you need poverty and density and a few other things as well. I wrote a big piece for National Review that's in this book about Chicago and why it has so many murders and trying to figure that out. And there's always these kind of pat political answers people give themselves that flatter their ideological preferences. But one of the reasons why Chicago has so much sort of street-level homicide is that it undertook a series of very successful organized crime prosecutions a few generations ago. And the thing about organized crime is it's organized. And so whereas once upon a time you had a Chicago drug industry that was controlled by a handful of middle-aged businessmen, essentially, now you've got one that's run by a big dispersed group of teenagers, each one of them, controlling 3 or 4 blocks. And you get a lot more friction that way. And so the underlying criminal energy, which comes from the sale and consumption of illegal drugs, didn't go away with the prosecutions when you put away Hoover and Barksdale and Fort and all those guys. The market was still out there. You just ended up having a much more anarchic and dangerous mechanism for serving the market. The same thing with getting rid of the big housing projects in places like the Green. This is probably good policy, but it didn't do anything to solve the underlying sociological issues. It just dispersed them throughout the city.
Right. And
so you see the same pattern in Chicago as you do in some places. Like Philadelphia is similar in some ways, although maybe not quite as extreme a problem as Chicago has.
Well, does Philadelphia
end up being really complicated?
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. Does Philadelphia still have the large housing complex and projects that we used to have here? Because we got rid of Robert Taylor Homes and Cabrini Green.
Yeah, Philadelphia does not have a lot of big housing complexes like that. It has a similar problem to Chicago's in the sense that it's a city that has relatively high crime, but basically all of the violent crime happens in a handful of small neighborhoods and doesn't really interact with the rest of the city that much. You could spend a whole month in Philadelphia and never know that this is a very high crime city. The same way you could spend a whole month walking around Chicago and never see anything that looked untoward. You never know that it's a place that has 500 murders a year.
Talk to us about sort of the instances of adverse selection that afflict some of these poor communities that you visited and wrote about.
Yeah, that's kind of what I mean by the salton sea effect. That, if you've got any kind of ambition, any kind of chance at education, any sort of, skills or even the energy to go out and pursue these things, you end up leaving these communities because there's really nothing there for you. Some of these places are places where there was some kind of economic disaster. There was an industry that everyone depended on, and that industry went away for some reason. That's kind of the case of San Bernardino, California, which I write about. But in a lot of places, in eastern Kentucky is one of these, there wasn't anything like that. They're places that have just sort of always been poor, and as the rest of the world gets wealthier, their poverty looks more dramatic in comparison. But so long as you have this group of people who are left behind, their problems stay there, and the people who leave take the social capital connections with them as they go. And it's a very different thing to be a poor person in a poor community than it is to be a poor person in a fairly well-off community. I grew up in a very poor family, but I grew up in a college town. So most of my friends, their parents were professional. They were college professors. They were doctors. They were things like that. And so I could kind of benefit from their social capital, learn about things like how do you go to college, how do you apply for financial aid, that sort of thing. But if you're in a community where you don't have anyone like that, where you've never known anybody who went to college, anybody who has a good job, where this sort of dependency and dysfunction and despair is just how life is lived, then, especially if you're young, if you're 15, 16 years old, you don't have the knowledge or the social imagination to really think about what your life could look like and then what steps you would have to take to get to that life. And that's a real problem for places, especially isolated rural places that don't have a lot of connections to the broader communities.
Social capital, that's such an important phrase, an important aspect of this that's under discussed. We only talk about dealing with poverty from a straight up capital perspective. How much more benefits are we going to provide, and in what form are they going to take, and so forth. And it seems to me that some of these poor white areas, or big white ghettos, as you call them, may be an opportunity to rethink welfare state policies more generally, because you take the race issue out of the equation and you just talk about incentives, and you talk about issues like social capital that persist perhaps in a different way, but are also relevant in urban neighborhoods that are decaying as well. And maybe this is where we can have discussions we need to have about poverty in America more generally, that we can apply regardless of race, because it's not so much about race, it's about incentive and environment.
Yeah, the race issue is, I think, again, the complexity of it is underappreciated, because the social and cultural differences in different communities around the country have to do with a lot more than race. And you can see this in that African-American communities in Tennessee are not very much like Baltimore or Detroit. They're different places. They're distinct places who have their own, local ways of doing things, their own local problems, and their own local approaches to things. And it is, I think, helpful to talk about situations of rural America, simply because a lot of people, unfortunately or fortunately, they tend to pay attention to the problems of white people, frankly, more than they do the problems of people who aren't white. I think that a lot of the people who are the policymakers have just sort of developed the assumption for years and years and years that Black and Latino neighborhoods, particularly in cities, are just going to be dysfunctional, and that's just it. And we just accept that schools are going to be terrible in Milwaukee, and we accept that schools are going to be terrible in Philadelphia, and we accept that there's going to be tremendously high rates of violent crime in these places. And I think that is that's a mistake. And if it takes, highlighting problems outside of those communities to get people to understand the commonalities, then I think maybe that's a useful thing to do.
Yeah, and conversely, though, I would challenge that just in this way. White people problems, the missing white girl versus the missing Black girl. Okay, but yeah, there's something there. But when it comes to things like schools, I mean, the school choice movement, which of course is driven by conservatives, that is mainly about providing opportunities for poor Latino and Black kids in urban centers. And there's not a lot of, it certainly includes the poor white families in places like Appalachia. But I mean, the focus of the conversation is about, what's happening to Black and brown families in New York and L.A. and Chicago.
Yeah, and in fact, it's a lot more for those communities, simply because if you're in a poor rural community, the next high school might be 75 miles away, and school choice isn't really much of a practical benefit for you. Whereas if you're in Boston or Chicago or Los Angeles, there are actually some pretty good schools around that you might want to send your kids to. So it's not as if people never pay attention to those things. I didn't mean to imply that at all. I think the way things resonate with people culturally is tied up in who they are. As I often point out, the policymaking conversation is dominated by people who are, for lack of a better term, elites, reasonably well-off, college-educated people. And the conversation necessarily reflects their biases and interests, which is why we spend so much time talking about, well, can Harvard practice affirmative action in its admissions processes, as though who gets into Harvard is really the defining social issue of poverty in America. It's not. But we spend a lot of time talking about college admissions and a lot less time talking about the high school dropout rate in Milwaukee or Baltimore.
The reason I like your book, much like the other books I mentioned that cover this from different ways, is because it's empathetic, but it's not a pity party. I mean, there's no pandering. It's trying to have real conversations with real people and get real perspective, like you said, trying to understand issues that are a little bit more complex as you go from community to community than you might understand from just looking at it on the outside. And I assume that the people you spoke with, that resonated too. I mean, that being treated with respect and hearing people out is something that maybe some of those folks don't enjoy too often.
Yeah, it's good to listen to people, and people like talking about their lives. I actually try to keep the sympathy out of the book as much as possible and focus more on accuracy. I often think sympathy and attempts to be empathetic, which is kind of a dumb word, but it's the one we use. I think they actually get in the way of good journalism a lot of the times because it makes the journalist think more about how he presents himself to the reader and to the public as this, compassionate, semi-heroic figure, rather than just, telling the story that needs to be told. So maybe there's some sympathetic stuff in there, but I've tried to keep it to a minimum.
All right. Not a hero. Kevin Williamson, roving correspondent for National Review. The book, Big White Ghetto, Dead Broke, Stone Cold Stupid, and High on Rage in the Dank Woolly Wilds of the Real America. Kevin, thanks for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thanks so much.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Since we've all been spending so much time at home, you probably figured out all the ways your house doesn't work for today's new lifestyle. Moving isn't an option, so why not consider remodeling? Maybe you need an open-plan kitchen with a school area, a flexible 3-seasons room, or a finished basement. Advanced Design Studio can help you create the reimagined house that works with how your family lives now. Providing positive remodeling experiences for nearly 30 years, Advanced Design's common sense remodeling process makes remodeling predictable, averting delays, and preventing budget overruns to produce a rewarding remodeling experience. Join us remotely Saturday, December 12th.